Hello, everyone. This is Kristen Huber, and on behalf of LucidWorks and 451 Research, I would like to welcome you and say thanks for attending today's webcast titled, Applying AI in Search in Europe, Now. Leading off today's discussion will be Matt Aslett, who is Research Vice President at 451 Research. Joining Matt will be Simon Taylor, who is Vice President of Worldwide Channels and Alliances at LucidWorks. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen and we'll get to as many as we can. The presentation slides are available for download in the resources section on your screen. And finally, please check back for the on-demand version of this webinar after the conclusion of the live event. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you everyone for joining us today on today's webinar. So just briefly before we get into that, let me give you a quick introduction to 451 Research for anybody who's not come across the organization before. So yeah, I'm Matt Aslett, I'm Research VP for Data, AI, and Analytics Channel. But 451 Research overall is a multifaceted IT research and advisory company. We were founded back in 2000, so now heading towards our 20th year, we have around 250 employees and serve more than 1,000 clients across the IT sector. In doing so, we publish over 52 million data points each quarter and over 4,500 reports each year, which enables us to cover more than 2,000 technology and service providers across a range of topics. So zeroing in on the focus of the webinar today, so we're going to be talking about data and analytics, obviously, but particularly in relation to the way in which we see it being used to accelerate digital transformation, and in particular, some of the issues related to AI, machine learning adoption, and some of the barriers to organizations both in EMEA but also in North America in terms of taking advantage of the opportunities there are to become more data driven and to get more business insight from the increasing volumes of data that they have available to them. So with that as the backdrop, obviously one of the key trends we see is this shift towards sort of digital transformation. And we start off with this slide, which is a data point from our Voice of the Enterprise Data Platforms and Analytics survey that we conducted earlier this year. And really wanted to start here because this really makes the point pretty well, I think. I hope that digital transformation, while it is something that obviously a lot of people talk about, I think it's fine to roll your eyes when you hear the term digital transformation again. There's a lot of companies talking the talk about it, but the important thing here is that it's something that companies are absolutely executing on as well. And as you can see here, 92% of enterprises that we surveyed are currently executing or developing digital transformation strategies. So it's not just a bit of hype. It's not just something that companies talk about. As you can see, 43% of companies are actually in the execution phase in terms of their digital transformation strategies. Another 27% evaluating, 22% considering. And so I think the key point here is if you're in that 8% that doesn't have currently a strategy in relation to digital transformation, this kind of statistic should be causing alarm bells. If you're in that 8% that really haven't even started yet, then what this shows is that the majority of your competitors probably have. And I would actually argue, if you're also in that 22% that are already considering it, you should also be concerned because either digital native startups or the existing companies that are in that 43% and 27% that are executing or evaluating are likely or more likely to perhaps survive the competitive environment given the shift towards digital transformation than those that don't. Another key trend, obviously, we see is organizations are using or increasing their use of data to drive strategic decision making. Of course, this is happening across the board, companies of all sizes, in all regions, we actually see that 91% of respondents are using at least or making at least some of their strategic decisions based on data, as you would expect. Perhaps more significantly, we're focused in a lot of our studies on the 14% that you can see here that we call the data drivers, where nearly all of their strategic decisions are data-driven, or nearly all their decisions are data-driven. These are the companies that are out there, being very proactive about how they use data within their organization to drive decision-making, throughout the organization, not just by, data scientists, data analysts, senior decision-makers, but by, knowledge workers and domain experts throughout the company. And perhaps, as you would expect, but it's always good when the data reinforces what you would expect to see. We do see that there is a correlation between the most data-driven companies and those companies that are executing when it comes to digital transformation. So if you can see here on this chart, so that in light blue we've got those data drivers where nearly all strategic decisions are data-driven. In the dark blue, we've got what we call the data drifters, companies that where very few strategic decisions are actually driven by data. And as you can see, over 70% of the most data-driven companies are in the execution stage in relation to digital transformation, compared to, I think it's about 27% of the least data-driven companies. So there really is a clear correlation between companies that are driving data-driven decision-making and also executing when it comes to digital transformation. And that's clearly not a coincidence. As far as we can see, obviously in many cases that broader digital transformation effort is a significant influence on the processes and the technology adoption that enables organizations to become more data-driven. Now, part of that move towards being more data-driven is obviously taking advantage of AI, machine learning technologies, and what I think is important about that, whilst there's a lot of huge potential obviously when it comes to AI, machine learning, particularly in terms of automating some of the most complex decision making or operations that we see within organizations. Today, particularly what we see is being used to automate some of the most mundane elements, but particularly to augment what humans are doing when it comes to, let's say, from a data analytics perspective, specifically, for example, when it comes to profiling data, or recommending visualizations, for example, or recommending obviously responses to for in terms of customer demand. So actually in many cases the actual decision is still being taken by a human in that case, but there's a lot of augmentation going on using AI machine learning, for example. When we look at the adoption of machine learning today, it's still clearly relatively in its early stages. So we see that 60% of organizations are not using machine learning at this point. And it's split fairly evenly, 20% between those that are currently using machine learning today and 20% who are in the proof of concept stage. But we do get a good sense that those percentages are going to rapidly increase as we see more and more organizations looking to take advantage of machine learning. I think what we see is a lot of companies today figuring out where it fits. There's a lot of data science experimentation going on to figure out where machine learning can best be applied to their business to get the best results. So we once organizations have been through those stages, we expect a rapid adoption. Now, of course, there are lots of reasons why companies are perhaps being a little bit limited in their use of machine learning today. And the number one, that anecdotally and also, as you can see here, according to our survey data that we see, is clearly the lack of skilled resources. Data scientists are few and far between and hard to come by, and I would say harder to hire, but even harder perhaps to keep hold of. But beyond that, also what we see is finding and accessing data is a significant barrier to machine learning, ranking only behind that, the lack of skilled resources. And this is particularly challenging as data is increasingly spread across multiple environments, not just in the enterprise or throughout the enterprise, but also throughout multiple cloud providers, multiple SaaS application providers, and it's just increasingly difficult for organizations to identify what data they have available to them and where it is. So in addition to doing the surveys, some of which I'm running through the results of here, we also, at 451 Research, regularly engage with enterprises in terms of longer conversations about the challenges they face, and I picked out a few sort of quotes from some of the narratives that we generate in relation to that. Obviously, they're all anonymized, so we can't account specifically who they relate to. But I think this is a really good example of what I was just talking about there. We've got an IT engineering manager talking about what is concerning is, in particular, isn't the nature of the data necessarily that's being stored with partners, but just how fragmented it is, 40, 50, 60, 100 different potential SaaS providers. And so, obviously in this case, we're talking specifically about customer data, it being spread, all across those different SaaS providers. So, the ability to just find what all that data, and be aware of where it all is something that organizations are particularly challenged with. Now, interestingly, when it comes to sort of thinking about this from a regional perspective, we actually see that finding and accessing data is currently a greater challenge amongst respondents to our surveys coming from Europe, Middle East, and Africa than it is North America, and this is just one of a number of different sort of regional differences we've highlighted here, and which are relevant when we're thinking about the ability of organizations to take advantage, obviously, of the opportunities that are available to them wherever they happen to be in the world. And also we see, another one here is that actually the importance of AI and machine learning to analytics projects is actually more widely recognized currently in North America than it is amongst companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And perhaps as I said, because we see a correlation between being more data driven and execution in relation to digital transformation strategies, perhaps therefore not a surprise that we see a higher proportion of enterprises in North America are actually currently executing or developing digital transformation strategies compared to those in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Actually, a pretty substantial number, 88% in the EMEA, but still, behind the 95% of North American companies. And this is something I think, over here in Europe, I think we should be very cognizant of and aware of that. There is a risk, amongst some organizations, obviously within the EMEA, of or the risk is more substantial, perhaps, of being left behind in relation to this drive towards digital transformation. So what do we mean by that? So another good quote here. Yeah, again, I said earlier, we talk about digital transformation. We've seen that it's something that companies are doing, but what are they actually doing? What does it mean? And I think this is a really good narrative I came across from an IT engineering manager in the manufacturing sector. What does digital transformation mean to him or her? It's about the ability to give the organization the ability to focus more on being proactive. And I think this is indicative of what we see across lots of organizations where, clearly there's been investments made over the years in data and analytics and digital technologies. But the organizations are still very actually reactive, and one of the key things that we see from the move towards being more data driven is trying to be more proactive and actually sort of preempt some of the potential challenges, and also potentially sort of preempt customer experience issues, for example, or gain competitive advantage. Now, this is another slide looking again at sort of regional differences, and here we're looking specifically at the benefits organizations are realizing from their data platforms and analytics adoption. I think what is particularly interesting about this is you've got, again, the blue is North America on the left, and the orange is Europe, Middle East, and Africa on the right. Actually, what you see is that some of these advantages are being enjoyed, or the benefits are being enjoyed more by organizations in Europe, Middle East, and Africa than they are in North America. So things like improving operational efficiency, improving customer experience, gaining competitive advantage, responding faster to opportunities and threats. And in fact, the one area actually where there's a significant difference that tips more towards North America is actually in terms of lowering costs. So I brought this up, I think, for two reasons. One is to sort of highlight that these are not, we're not saying these are good or bad. Sometimes differences are just differences. There's cultural differences, there's differences of focus, difference of perspective. As I said, they're not good or bad, but it's interesting to note what they are. But the other thing is to point out here that, actually, even though companies across Europe, Middle East, and Africa perhaps aren't declaring themselves to be executing when it comes to digital transformation or being successful with data and analytics, actually they are enjoying the benefits, and in many cases they're enjoying the benefits more than some of their North American counterparts. So it's not that clearly that companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa aren't being successful. So it's kind of interesting when then you look at, we ask companies again to rate themselves the extent to which they see themselves as being data-driven. And we see that a significantly higher proportion of enterprises in North America consider themselves amongst the most data-driven companies, 19% compared to only 10% in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And perhaps, based on what we just saw in terms of the benefits being enjoyed, there's an element here of, companies in North America just being that little bit more, let's say, sort of self-assured or willing to bang their chest about, the successes they're seeing and how data-driven they are. And perhaps companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, maybe not being as vocal about the successes they're having, because as we see, they are enjoying those benefits. So it's an interesting point, and sometimes it comes down, as I say, to sort of cultural differences rather than sort of true differences in terms of technology adoption or success rate. So I wanted to roll back here just a little bit, just to finish off on, and we made the point earlier about finding and accessing data is a key barrier, particularly obviously, as I mentioned before, to adoption of AI machine learning. But it's true, in terms of any kind of generation of business insight from data. And I think this again is another quote that really speaks to that. Is that clearly, people, generally speaking, there's a much greater realization of the value of data today. All organizations get that. They know, they need to be taking more decisions based on data. The key difference, I think, when it comes to those that are actually executing, those that are being more data-driven, is the ability with speed and efficiency to get access to that data and get to the answers they need. And that's what I think ultimately sort of really differentiates the most data driven from the least data driven is the speed with which they can actually find and access that data, which brings us on to the focus on sort of search and the importance of search in relation to data and analytics generally, but AI machine learning in particular. And I think what we see is that there are significant potential benefits of natural language search as an interface for finding and accessing data. Obviously just lowers the barriers to analytic insight in terms of that use of natural language queries. In particular, there's we see a growing focus on data literacy and growing the ability of non-specialist workers within an organization to actually access and use data as part of their work, and that could be C-level executives, or it could just be less technical personnel, domain experts, to actually intuitively query data. And in particular, we see that search is particularly important in surfacing insight from unstructured data. Obviously, one of those areas which organizations have been improving their use of sort of unstructured data for business insight over the years, but still an area where there's a lot of data that actually goes perhaps unexploited in terms of generating business insight. Now, this again is an interesting insight here from a survey we did earlier this year, and it's just talking about sort of emerging business intelligence interfaces, and in particular the one I wanted to point out here was actually, we phrased it in this question, natural language text interfaces. Basically we were talking about natural language search, and what we see is, what's interesting, so in dark blue you've got all respondents overall, and we were asking them, what was their level of interest within their organization in terms of these new interface technologies. And what was quite interesting is I was quite surprised, I must admit, that we saw only 16% of all respondents saying they had a good interest in natural language text interfaces. But what was told a whole different story is when you zeroed in on the most data-driven companies, the data drivers as we call them here. And that, as you see across the board in terms of all these technologies, they're way ahead. But looking at natural language text interfaces in particular, 34% of organizations with a significant interest in using natural language text interfaces as part of their analytics deployments. So again, what we see is that it's the most data-driven companies that stand to gain the most from adoption of all these interfaces into analytics, particularly also the natural language query interfaces. And back to the other point I made in terms of sort of the importance of search for generating insight from unstructured and semi-structured data, that's going to be an increasingly important capability, because we see that a growing number of enterprises are expecting to use unstructured textual data for AI machine learning over the next couple of years. So only 42% of organizations say they're using unstructured and semi-structured textual data for AI and ML today, but that is going to increase to about 88% within the next 2 years based on the respondents to our latest AI machine learning survey. So, as I said, that unstructured, semi-structured data has perhaps gone underexploited for many, many years, but that looks set to change considerably with the use of that data within AI machine learning projects over the next couple of years. So with that, it was obviously a bit of a rapid run through of the state of the market as we see it, and various trends that we see shaping the space. So I wanted to just conclude here by just sort of summarising some of the key trends and perhaps point to some recommendations about what organisations can do going forward. So the first thing is, as I said, digital transformation is absolutely real, and it is happening. 92% of enterprises are currently executing or developing digital transformation strategies. So, if you are out there in that 8% or even that 22% that are only considering, now is, it's probably maybe even be past time to do something about it. Because there is that risk of getting left behind. But, definitely either start thinking about what your organization can do now, or alternatively perhaps start thinking about whether there's opportunities at other organizations that are being more proactive in terms of digital transformation. Secondly, we see the most data-driven companies are also taking a lead when it comes to digital transformation. I talked about the correlation there, and perhaps no surprise, but the data really highlights that it is a significant trend that the most data-driven companies are predominantly ahead in terms of executing when it comes to digital transformation. So I think enterprises that are behind with regards to making data-driven decisions, and particularly as we've seen in EMEA, where there appears to be at the very least perhaps a bit of some work to be done to catch up with North American companies in terms of making data-driven decisions. There is the potential to be just a disadvantage there. Finding and accessing data, as we've seen, is a significant barrier to analytics and machine learning, second only to the available skills. But it is particularly, seems to be a greater barrier to companies in Europe, Middle East and Africa than it is in North America. And so this is an area I think, we see across the board, companies need to step up, but, both on the vendor side and the enterprise side, this needs to be an area of focus. It's it's still a challenge where there's been improvements across many other areas, but there's still this challenge in terms of finding and accessing data. And as I said, in many cases, as data is increasingly spread across multiple providers, multiple clouds, multiple SaaS applications, it's actually in some ways getting more difficult. Natural language search, though, obviously, as we said, can absolutely help with that in terms of lowering those barriers to analytic insight in terms of the expertise. And as we have seen, it is set to play an increasingly important role in that it enables the surfacing of insight from unstructured data, which we see is set to play an increasing role in machine learning projects in particular. And as such, as we've seen, that it's the most data-driven companies, and so the same ones that are actually taking a lead when it comes to digital transformation also stand to gain the most from adoption of natural language query interfaces. So really reinforcing the point that if you're not in that category right now, those that are going to potentially double their benefit of being in that category. So organizations that haven't taken greater steps to be more data driven, to execute when it comes to digital transformation, really absolutely need to start thinking about how they do that and lower that gap perhaps to those that have. So with that, thank you very much for your time. We're going to open up, obviously, at the end here for questions. So welcome any questions then, either on the research I presented here or obviously any other areas of interest. But with that, I will hand you over to Simon from Lucidworks to talk about the world in relation to the trends that I've described here as Lucidworks and he sees it.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. Appreciate it. So a couple of quick words on Lucidworks before we sort of move into this sort of area. So Lucidworks, and a very nice segue from Matt as well, is one of the world's leading search and insight engine technology vendors. And as a result, obviously, some of the challenges that Matt talked about in terms of how people think about digital transformation and the digital workplace, if you like, and try and address that with specific technologies, we sort of tackle head on. So to that point then, let's talk a little bit about how we move and respond to some of the directional elements that Matt's talked about and really turn that into sort of some operational type of executable capabilities that you can actually go and implement. So the first thing, though, is to really set the scene as to why a lot of the things that Matt's talking about are challenging for organizations, specifically in relation to creating a digital or transformative enterprise. And really, that comes down to a lot of the ways that we've actually been using legacy technologies. So it should be no surprise to most of the people on the call here that the old big data methodologies around moving and managing large quantities of data, while still necessary for certain types of aggregation or certain types of historic and linear perspectives on trend, is not necessarily the most or quickest way of getting to a very transformative environment, particularly when you're looking for immediate insight into information. So what we often find is the typical process here that you're saying in these sort of 8 steps is fairly restrictive for most organizations, and we tend to spend a lot of time these days trying to move data, transforming it into an environment that we can actually sort of understand it, and less time really responding to the question or problem that the business is proposing as to what we would call the last mile challenge. So, and this is why the majority of most of big data projects fail today, because we spend too much time on crunching data and less time actually visualizing and presenting data from an insight perspective. So contrast that with a much broader perspective of focusing on actually getting to realize the value of information by just transforming it into a sort of insight engines framework. And that's using things like an inverted index model, but it's very much around looking at data in place, not having to move and manage it a second time, accessing it from where it is, resolving different domains of data in a common way through maybe an entity-based model, and then from that, pushing it into an index framework that allows you to gain insight to that, and then look for particular types of aspects of that you can align to search, you can align to analytics, and then visualizing that very quickly. And that's very much what we try and focus on within Lucidworks, is to try and operationalize that. And really a lot of the secret sauce that comes in that is to really simplify the tasks that would normally have created a lot of effort from a data scientist point of view. So you'll see as we go through this, whether it's machine learning and AI, and we're going to transition onto that conversation in a second, operationalizing that side of the thought process, particularly on machine learning, is key to actually gaining insight. And as a result, we often find that very much we can transform people's thought process and certainly their timeframes around projects significantly, and in many cases almost 9 to 10 times faster than traditional data lifecycle management. So the main question then, as we get into this whole transformative exercise, and assuming that we can actually go and move it into an insight framework, is when do we introduce AI, or what is AI in the whole process? And Matt talked a little bit about this from a machine learning point of view, and the whole sort of bucket of AI and machine learning really is a big sort of nebulous area for most organizations today. And the reason why is because a lot of people have some misconceptions around the value of AI in digital transformation projects. And that really falls into three main categories. One is to do with the data source. A lot of data actually, when it's transformed or in place from, say, a big data point of view, isn't necessarily in the right format. It isn't necessarily encompassing the right metadata. And as a result, it results in sort of a bad learning model from a machine learning perspective. That isn't necessarily the case, but it's an aspect of people's thought process when they think about the value and how they can operationalize machine learning. The second thing is they think that machine learning is going to be fallible at some or infallible at some point, and they don't want a dependency on it. And a good example is in healthcare, and we've seen some good examples in recent times of how challenging that's been to introduce machine learning. And then, of course, there's this other thought process, which is it's a very narrow view of a perspective of an organization, and it can and can't be, and therefore doesn't necessarily take into consideration the wider context. So you just focus in a specific area of particular data and forget the corresponding related sources. And that really isn't really a perspective that you get when you think about machine learning in the context of insight engines or search technology, because search is broader. Search does create more of a perspective across the enterprise, and when you apply machine learning to that, it's a lot more valuable. So when we think about the challenges of adopting AI and machine learning, particularly in a search framework, we think about it in three areas. So in other words, what is the goal of the business leader from the point of view of introducing machine learning? In other words, it could be natural language, it could be the type of question that I'm proposing versus a typical type of query construction that would have happened historically. From a data scientist perspective, it might be that we want to simplify this or get to a truly insightful perspective very quickly, but without consuming too many IT resources. And then on the IT side, it might be, just generally an awareness and understanding around the value of machine learning from the point of view of education and adoption versus making it more of a theory of everything type conversation. So when we think about operationalizing it, we think about it in two contexts, which is one, defining first of all what AI is and what it isn't. So we think of AI as very much a narrow intelligence focus. So we're operationalizing a specific area of need around a particular set of data, and that's where machine learning plays. What it isn't is very much the Star Wars or I'm going to take over the universe type model from Terminator. We're not talking about the whole aspect of that area, which is a lot broader. It's conversely very, very narrow. And as a result, when we think about how we focus this, it does start to get people more interested in very specific areas. And I always pick up on healthcare because I have a background in that area, and pharmaceuticals, just because it's an easy way to think about it. So, whether it's making doctors, for instance, more efficient in terms of the question and answers they want on particular maybe chronic disease, or it's maybe something more operational in a hospital for things like bed management and ensuring that we can get patients to treatment a lot more quickly. Those are really operationalized views of how machine learning can help. And we're going to see that as we think about digital transformation in a second. So a good way of sort of segueing really into how we use technology and how LucidWorks apply that in the context of the challenges and the direction that Matt was presenting is to really get a good definition of machine learning. And machine learning really is based on systems that can learn from data and identify patterns and make decisions, ultimately within a type of visualization that allows people to really pose those questions quickly and get the answers efficiently. And really, that's really addressing what I said earlier, which is the last mile problem head on. So instead of spending lots and lots of time crunching data to the point where we really can't do much from the context of responding to a question, it's flip that model around and say, really, what is the question we're trying to propose? And then work backwards to make sure that we can get the right data into an insight framework to serve that up through the right machine learning and insight, and then deliver that to a prospective user group. And that's very much the focus. So it should be no surprise, and here's a good example of a framework for machine learning that, and this was from Gartner, which is very much around how you input data and how you apply machine learning. There's various different models around that. I mean, candidly, machine learning today is really typically all about the 3 C's, which is classification, clustering, and collaborative filtering. And most supervised machine learning is classification driven, which means we're going to try and surface relationships of information so that we can better understand how to explore it, how to search it, how to propose relevancy, and ultimately rank and deliver results better from a search perspective. And that's ultimately what it's about. So what we tend to do is we've simplified a lot of the execution of machine learning by templating a lot of the major math algorithms that go into that from a data science perspective and applying them very quickly and at the click of a button when you're actually implementing these types of solutions. And what that means is you can mature yourself from typical keyword search, which is really a thing of the past today, and how people constructed queries, to more sort of taxonomy and entity-based extraction. So we're getting much more into specifics around the organizational structure of the information, to understanding intent and prediction, so we can start to make a better recommendation, understand relevancy in the context of additional information sets around what people are querying and searching. Moving into automated relevancy and tuning. Now, what does that mean? That means that realistically, most search technology today works on the basis of more a rule set, a static query set. So in other words, if I search for these 3 words, I will get this response, versus if I search for these 3 words, depending on the corpus of information associated with how other people have searched in the past, what they have found is relevant and what they continue to search for today, let me tune the responses so that I get a lot more automated relevancy. That's what we call a personalization model inside of our sort of signals-based processing environment, which is a cornerstone of how we view AI. Signals are click streams. They're things that people navigate to or access or search, and how they rate and rank and define whether something that as a result of search is relevant to the query in the first place. So we use all of that information to create a much more tuned model. And then the self-learning aspect, the fact that this thing can go unattended and become more and more accurate over time. And we'll talk about some example use cases at the end of this session of the value in that area. So this is really the maturity curve, and obviously in the context of what I've just been talking about, machine learning and AI, the idea is to take you from keyword search to much more to the self-learning environment, so you get a tuned environment to go and respond to these needs of a digital transformation much more quickly. Because how can you transform the enterprise unless you can make it more automated and tuned to deliver more relevancy and results? So to that point, as we start now delving into the tool sets a little bit more specifically and what actually goes on with technologies like LucidWorks, let's just make a very broad definition here. A lot of AI tools start today with data, right? And as I mentioned earlier, that's very much the old paradigm. What we're trying to do there moving forward is to start with the human question and the problem and work backwards. So we focus on that very specifically and construct the right type of search and results that relate to the question that's being proposed by the business user, and not just necessarily a combination of data that we may want to do something with in the future. So as a result, we're focusing on search specifically rather than tool set. And that's very much Hannah, who heads our data science at LucidWorks, main mantra as to how we sort of implement the technology. And the best way of looking at it is to think about this from a left to a right side environment. So if we think about digital transformations, maybe the workplace, it could be e-commerce as well, but let's just think about it as internally facing users, which is the employees, and we have a corpus of data on the left. What really does all of this conversation relate to in terms of capabilities that move people in that direction so that we can answer a question? And it goes from everything from indexing content, which is basically not moving and managing data. It's taking the important meta and insight from that information and constructing a view of it that we can then utilize from a search point of view. It's things like faceting, topicing, clustering, which is about looking for patterns of data that we can then propose as maybe ways of filtering or navigation into information. It's about defining query rules and maybe automating the construction of query rules, query rule rewriting we call it, so that we can tune the way that search results. It's about the incorporation of natural language, so we can ask a question without having to use things like Boolean logic to go and really construct an old sort of keyword phrase model. It's about applying math to surface classification and specific types of relationships of data that make the relevancy that we deliver in terms of results much more contextual to maybe a particular vertical or industry segment. And that includes things like ontology or other types of use of markup models. And then it's user signals. And user signals is the most interesting part, really, when you think about what is a signal. We'll talk about that in a second, but a signal is really anything that is created by a user that defines relevancy, and building that into a learning model that ultimately defines much more accuracy around search results. And then finally, boosted results. Boosted results is just a terminology we use, but basically it's making sure that if things haven't been searched historically, but they are 99.9% more accurate, instead of them being at the bottom of a search set of results, we boost them to the top of the results, because they may not have any history, but more importantly, for the topic that someone's searching on, they are 100% more accurate. So we make sure that happens in the models as well. So I mentioned earlier something called personalization. Well, personalization is the cornerstone to automating the whole learning model. So if you think about that little stepwise approach I took you from keyword to self-learning, personalization is the key. And really what that means is that we're going to create a model where we can really take as much user intent as possible and then relate that to an insight framework, which is driven by indexing, that allows us to rewrite and tune the results that people receive over time. And that has different aspects to it, which it goes beyond things like static rules and profilings to customizing experiences based on data signals. And it involves maybe adapting some of the machine learning that goes on more dynamically as well. But it's also about another level of learning. And we may get onto this today, and maybe some of the questions later. But typically today, there's been a sort of paradigm shift over time from the definitions of what AI is to now then machine learning. And really what we're talking about today is something called deep learning, which is a non-curated model around learning, which is instead of me saying I want to know everything about a particular state in terms of demographics, population, landscape, topology, state voter preferences, things like that. That's a curated model of me then pushing that into a machine learning model and then telling me what I need to know. A non-curated model for deep learning is just say, tell me everything about the state. And it comes back with all the information that's relevant to that by understanding the relationship of the data. That's sort of where we're moving today. And a good example is on this side, and we think about it pretty much in two domains at LucidWorks. One is on the digital commerce, externally facing customer, and then the digital workplace, internally facing. And these are good examples of where you can apply and gain some really immediate value. And that's everything from predictive merchandising to catalog search to really sentiment analysis to understand, by a trend, to even things like personal assistants and chatbots, question answering systems, so that we can specifically resolve people's questioning through natural language, but give them the right type of responses that they need. And then in the digital workplace, it's all about making the employee more engaged, giving them access to information, call centers, support, resolving things like wait times that people have in terms of information. But it's also maybe some very specific things like, for instance, in the banking world, there's 3 levels in a bank, and level 3 audit and compliance, fraud detection, anti-money laundering. In the healthcare world, it's things like patient 360 type portals, giving people access to information in ways that are much more meaningful. So these are what we call the digital workplace solutions. But these are really good examples. So when we apply this whole concept and this technology, there really is a number of parts to what we do at LucidWorks, and we don't have time to get into all of this today, but I'll suffice to say I'll really highlight 3 areas. So Fusion Server, which is Fusion, by the way, is the LucidWorks platform technology that actually delivers all this capability in a very point and click, easily assemblable way. is a cornerstone of our indexing. That's allowing us to create effectively an information model that we can explore through search, and that includes automatic connections to sources, of which we have over 300 connectors, automatic ETL and pipeline ingestion of data, mapping that into a framework that we can utilize from a search point of view. And then we have Fusion AI, which is really in two areas. There's more of a data perspective and then more of a user signals perspective. So the data perspective is on the way in, and that's what we're doing there, is actually applying NLP, NER to incorporate a lot of additional context and language to the data as it moves into index. We're also classifying the data. We're also clustering it through machine learning. We're also looking for anomalies, and that's a very strong area of what we do, for instance, in really identifying areas that we can expose for much more insight. And a good example, as we'll see in a second, is maybe from a security point of view. It's applying an anomaly detection model around things like ransomware, or things that relate to human-related behavior to, say, network-related behavior in the context of incident response for security. Much more the next generation paradigm of how people think about security. And then on the outbound, or the user side, that's very much all about the signals processing I was mentioning. But it's also about understanding what good looks like. So we do something we call A/B testing, which is very much about saying, look, if you were to perform a search today with keyword and what would you get back, versus with something with natural language and with signals applied, and you can see that almost a juxtaposition in terms of the relevancy and content that relates to that user request. And then the third area is App Studio, which is a visualization technology, allowing us to build UI very quickly. And that's basically what allows us to work backwards from the question that's proposed by users and business users, which is to build a visualization quickly that links to data, that applies insight in a much more relevant way to respond to that, and in a matter of hours versus weeks or months to get to that perspective. And we mentioned machine learning for anomaly detection. I think I'm not going to cover this in too much detail because I sort of referred to it when I was talking through it, but essentially it's looking for patterns in data that you don't necessarily know about. I mean, good things from a security point of view are great, for example, as an analogy, if you know what you're looking for, so a bad security policy, a network breach, using basically a log-based model, that's great. But if something's happening a bit more nebulous to that, so for example, maybe a backup failed, maybe there's a database corruption, maybe a user can't access through their credentials anymore, but then there's a vast quantity of email that arrives. These are all anomalies that can be surfaced through an insight model that, when you put them in context, create the perspective that actually we're in a breach scenario here. The organization's been breached, and there are a number of different attack vectors that are now combining to create something that I need to respond to from an incident perspective. That's sort of a next generation machine learning model of anomaly detection. But there are other things just to do with the data as well that we apply detection around. And then from a signals perspective, a lot of people ask us all the time, well, what is a signal? Basically everything a user can do. So that's from what you search for, how you navigate, how you find, how you relate, how you rank. If you put that in the context of Amazon, it would be what you buy last week, what you're about to buy, what you've searched for, your search history, how you've explored and navigated other types of content. If cookies are embedded in your browser, it's what else you did outside of that creates a signal. All of these signals, when you bring this together, creates a different perspective on relevancy, because now we can really create much more of user intent and apply that to the data to boost them and respond to the results more effectively. So finally, when we bring this all together, what does it mean from the point of view of assembling a type of solution? And this is really the wow slide, if you like, from the point of view of making you aware of how quickly you can do this. So once data is actually available and we bring it into index, that's a very quick thing. I mean, most indexing technologies today, if you're using open source, sure, you have to do a lot of development. What Fusion does, and again, the background of LucidWorks is, we've been in the indexing space for many, many years, and in fact, we are some of the major committers to the Solar open source project. We still write about 70% of that source code. And Fusion is an abstraction of Solar, but basically, Fusion indexes the data, brings it into an environment very quickly, automatically, that you can do something with. And then from that, you can decide on what you want to index, how you want to search for it, where you want to apply AI. And then we create a rapid assembly model. So you can just plug in the intellectual elements that allow you to decide exactly how you want to present something, whether it's natural language, whether it's signals, whether it's machine learning algorithm. I mentioned we have 19 different out-of-the-box algorithms, and also you can customize your own, whether it's entity extraction because you're in a particular area of the world where the language set needs to be modeled in different ways. Maybe we want to apply a linguistics model. And then the rules and queries that relate to that. And then from that, create a templating environment so we can deliver a very specific type of end user experience and visualize that within a matter of hours. And this is really what happens within the technology. And to go back to all of the conversation from Matt's insight around the marketplace with 451, and really what I've been trying to present as a way to segue into digital transformation projects through the application of operationalized machine learning. This brings this all together to say, basically, you can deliver this today in a very rapid way with a minimal amount of skill set and go and create those transformative solutions in ways that you haven't thought about and without actually incorporating a lot of legacy big data techniques. So in terms of final, just bringing this to conclusion then, when we think about the types of solutions or experiences we can get from this, there are very, very insightful things that be curated this way. And we call them powering connecting experiences. And that's everything from customer care, to basically improve customer experience, and we'll show you some examples of that in a second, to maybe getting more insight into data. We have organizations responding to GDPR in Europe, for example. And I didn't want to make this a true GDPR presentation today, but specifically, GDPR is about people, process, policy, largely around responding to mandates from subject access to right to delete. But really, there's another aspect of GDPR, which is where is my risk? Where is my data? How does that data combine to create risk? Where does it go? Where is it being stored? What is sensitive? What isn't sensitive data? So we have partners and customers that have built solutions in those areas using Fusion to specifically address that. Employee Q&A, which is more natural language, which is really creating a learning model and delivering results in a much more automated way based on the types of questions that people propose. And that's a deep learning model as well, so applying some next generation of that. We could think about data pivot, think about data warehousing or data, big data environments and BI today, but in a much more insightful way. So instead of looking at 10 years of aggregated data, think about, well, maybe what if I got insight into my real-time data and I could combine 4 or 5 different data sets and 20 to 30 different types of entities, combine them into a model to say, how do I optimize my supply chain? How does my component manufacturing affect my servicing? Maybe in the automotive industry, where we want to try and minimize the cost of vehicle recalls because not all vehicles have a defect, because I can't relate the product defect to the segment of vehicles and the distribution of them for a particular location. We have organizations that have built that. And then compliance and audit. Good examples there, as I mentioned, level 3 audit in a bank, but also anti-money laundering, 17A compliance for a broker-dealer, things like that as well. And I've got 3 examples just to focus on here. So PwC is a very good example. It's available on LucyWorks website, where they created a single global source of truth around knowledge management. 40,000 employees every day go and use their search technology that basically tells them about their clients, about the people they're interacting with inside and outside the organization, and really how to go and approach them with something that's more meaningful. And it could be, for instance, they call it a next best action around their client base, which is, what conversation can we have with them today? And let's bring in a whole corpus of data together from multiple different applications to deliver that. Red Hat is another customer as which basically increased their support function, 91% reduction in their cost of ownership model, just purely about automating a sort of responsive model around delivering knowledge to customer support, and also improving wait times to do with how long it took to get the most relevant information. That's a direct result of things like signals, learning models, about relevancy boosting, ranking. It's a direct result of machine learning, our clustering classification, so that we can better associate the right type of information to the right type of request, particularly from a natural language perspective. And then finally, something specific to e-commerce, where the particular ROI around the e-commerce model, when you're dealing to B2B or B2C, is almost an immediate conversion rate, because if you can improve search, then you can resolve many things that are wrong with most websites today. The big one, of course, is if you can't find it, you can't buy it. So improving the way people search for things, and And I've challenged everybody today, go to a website, search for something a bit obscure and see what comes back. If nothing comes back, that's the cardinal sin of e-commerce, which is you shouldn't get 0 results back. You should get something that relates to your question as much as possible, so that either internally or externally to that particular retailer, you can have an experience. And if they don't deliver that, then you probably leave that site. So that's the type of thing we address, and we addressed it for Vegas.com very specifically. So with that, I think I've come to the end of my segment, and we've got some time for some brief questions. So let me hand back to the organisers here, and we'll respond to any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Simon. And as you mentioned, it is now time for our Q&A session, and we do have a few questions that have come in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So first question, how are GDPR and other similar regulations impacting the ability to be more data-driven?
Yeah, perhaps if I kick off this, Simon obviously covered some of that in his closing comments there. But clearly, obviously, GDPR and other similar regulations are highly relevant, particularly in relation to obviously what organisations can do with with data that can be identified in relation to an individual. And I think we have seen some cases where it's giving companies sort of a bit of pause, perhaps, in terms of how they use that kind of data, or if and how they use that data in relation to sort of machine learning projects. But I think more generally in relation to sort of being more data driven. I think, as Simon said, what it has done is really focus the attention on, well, what are the risks and how do you best address that? And actually, in that, to that extent, these kind of regulations are actually beneficial, and obviously they cause some headaches. They do need to be responded to, but they are beneficial in terms of driving, focusing the attention on the risk and what needs to be done to prevent them. And so we have seen, actually, we just closed the survey just recently, the last couple of weeks, and we've seen data privacy and specifically regulatory compliance requirements increasing up in terms of sort of some of the barriers to being more data driven. So I think that shows that organizations are being more cognizant of that. And, that has to be a good thing ultimately, even if obviously there are some smaller challenges to be overcome in relation to making the most of it.
Sure, thanks, Matt. And let me add a couple of points there very specifically. So what we see is really a couple of areas in relation to being data driven. So you can't really address a lot of GDPR requirements until you understand your data. And most people's view of data privacy is entity based. So it's things like social security number, it's a credit card, passport number, any personal identifiable information sets. But what people really have failed to really understand, and this is where the risk paradigm jumps in, is the nature of data and how that changes. So demographically, time-wise. So you could have 2 emails, for example, that contain certain amounts of relevant, maybe personal data, but separately they're not a big issue. The moment you combine them, all of a sudden that changes the sensitivity. Move that into a non-EU state, and you've got a broader issue to do with GDPR. And it's that type of insight that's making more people focus on the data-driven aspect of GDPR. In other words, understanding the data set to better respond to the risk elements that it presents. Okay, next
Great,
question.
thank you, Simon and Matt. Sure, next question is, what is the challenge that employees in large enterprises are confronting with the amount of data now available to them to do their jobs?
Let me take that one, and then I'll hand back to Matt. So we've tackled that one. We see that one head on today because it's the main reason why a lot of employers are not as engaged as they would normally be in a workplace. So that's why I was talking about digital workplace type methodology earlier on, because the challenge is multiple silos of data, multiple data sets, and if you can't bring them together in the workplace in an efficient workplace model, employees can't really function properly. So that's really something that I'm seeing that we're tackling head on. A lot of other industry players are tackling head on to try and bring information together in much more of a framework that can deliver that type of experience. And that PwC example I highlighted earlier is a very good example of 40,000 people coming in every day to look across 20 to 30 different applications and 30 to 40 different silos of data to get a much better experience. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, again, I kind of touched on this. I think, one of the key challenges is obviously the spread of data throughout not just the organization, but across different, locations, different service providers, different cloud providers, different application providers. And one thing, obviously, that can lead to is data silos. Data silos is something, obviously lots of companies have tried over the years to try and overcome, because, the more siloed the data, the more, limited access, and the potential therefore, that data does not be used or to go unused, and therefore, obviously, if you're not accessing that data, you can't find and access that data. There's the potential for, back as we said earlier, increasing risks in relation to that data, particularly in relation to sort of compliance concerns. So yeah, I think that's one of the key things we see. More data. It's clearly there are definitely benefits to having greater volumes of data across the organisation to potentially use. So there are also some real significant challenges that come with that.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll close it up. Is LucidWorks working for value-added resellers in certain industries, such as telecom or media?
Yeah, actually, let me tackle that one. So at least you're talking to the right person there, because I run all of our partners and alliances globally at LucidWorks. So the short answer is yes. We have a very extensive network of value-added resellers globally, and that normally maps to different vertical areas as well. What we do find, though, depending on where the speciality is of the value-added reseller, that obviously there's some specific pain points. We talked about GDPR, which is a bit sort of cross-vertical in Europe, but there are other more regulated industries that have very specific needs. So, for instance, finance, healthcare, for example, government. Telcos has very specific needs around linguistics, telephony, and also, for instance, voice-to-text type conversion on a Q&A model. Lots of very specific things, more than we can talk about today, but in short answer to the question is yes, absolutely we do map to a whole bunch of value-added resellers in different verticals.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I know we had some other questions that came in, and we will definitely respond to those via email once the webinar concludes. So thank you so much again, Matt and Simon. As a reminder, the on-demand replay of this webcast will be available shortly. So on behalf of LucidWorks and 451 Research, thank you for attending and have a great day.